Imagine spending 5 minutes somewhere and making an impression on the people you meet for the rest of their lives. That's what President John F. Kennedy did when he landed in Moses Lake, Washington.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
President Kennedy was a space visionary and a Cold Warrior.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
He was a serious thinker and an optimist about our nation's future.
The potential of this country is unlimited.
In memories of his audiences and the recordings of his speeches, his wisdom and wit are still alive today.
So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us.
I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency, and whether you can recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is, the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others, at least for a while.
As brilliant as he was in his public talks, this is not a story about President Kennedy at the podium. This is a document of a moment of his life between the speeches. This is a story of how he moved people by shaking their hands and saying hello during a brief visit to Moses Lake on September 26, 1963.
I've come on a journey of 5 days across the United States, beginning in Pennsylvania and ending in California, to talk about the conservation of our resources.
The day President Kennedy touched down in Moses Lake, he was on the western leg of a tour across the United States to talk about energy and the environment. At Hanford, Washington, he spoke at a groundbreaking for a reactor designed to produce plutonium and electricity.
Today's conservation movements must therefore embrace disciplines unknown in the past. It must marshal our vast technological resources in behalf of our resource supply.
Before that speech at Hanford, President Kennedy had been in Moses Lake. Moses Lake is about 35 miles north of Hanford, 85 miles south of Grand Coulee Dam, 145 miles east of Seattle, and 94 miles west of Spokane. The lakeside town was founded in 1897 on the ceded territory of the Moses Columbia tribe of Native Americans who had followed Chief Moses to the Colville Reservation. In the early days of Moses Lake and other nearby towns, farmers transformed sagebrush-covered ground into dryland wheat farms. In the 1950s, farmers made use of water from Grand Coulee Dam to transform the desert-like terrain into large-scale, irrigated farm blocks. Crops were not the only thing to grow around Moses Lake. In 1940, Moses Lake had 326 people. By 1950, the population was almost 3,000. By the early 1960s, Moses Lake was a city with a population of over 12,000. It was defined by what historians Freya Leggett and Ann Shemp refer to in their book about Moses Lake as the growing triad of agriculture, air power, and tourism. The air power was based north of downtown. The annual Moses Lake Air Show will give you an idea of what this place was like when it was buzzing with military aircraft. It is known today as the Port of Moses Lake's Grant County International Airport. But when President Kennedy visited, this was the Strategic Air Command's Larson Air Force Base. It was home to SAC's 462nd Strategic Aerospace Wing, led by Colonel David A. Tate. The wing operated 3 underground Titan I missile complexes that encircled Moses Lake and flew B-52 bombers and KC-135 mid-air refueling tankers from 2 long runways that happened to form an X that marked the spot where President Kennedy touched down at Larson Air Force Base.
One of the highlights we had while I was there was the President John Kennedy came to Larson in September of 1963. Being base commander, I had the honor of being his official host the whole time, and I was with him the whole time he was on the station.
Colonel Clyde W. Owen arranged the crowd control and other details of President Kennedy's short time at Larson Air Force Base. The movement of the president from his jet to a Marine One helicopter that would shuttle him to Hanford was carefully choreographed. Captain Donald R. Couture, a helicopter pilot at Larson Air Force Base, helped with the logistics of the president's arrival.
His team was there for 2 weeks before he got there, preparing for his visit. So we got to know some of his pilots, his crew chiefs, his everything. And they said what a wonderful man he was.
When President Kennedy appeared at Larson Air Force Base, he had a brief but warm reception. According to records of Evelyn Lincoln, President Kennedy's personal secretary, at 2:35 p.m., the president landed at Larson Air Force Base. At 2:40 p.m., he boarded the helicopter that took him to Hanford. An Air Force report describing President Kennedy's time in Moses Lake said he greeted high-ranking civilians and military officials, and then altered his itinerary by approaching the crowd and spending about 5 minutes shaking hands. The 5 minutes of attention from the president meant a lot to the people who met him, the lucky few among a crowd that the Air Force estimated could have included up to 7,000 people. Captain Couture's wife, Anne, was among the thousands assembled at Larson Air Force Base to greet President Kennedy. She was filming with an 8mm camera as the president arrived on Air Force One. Decades later, Captain Couture, who often voted Republican, explained his support for the Democrat Kennedy and recalled the president's visit to Moses Lake.
I voted for Kennedy for a number of reasons. One, I think he had the personality that the country needed at the time. He was very charismatic. He appeared to be a decent leader. He was a war hero, you might say. He just seemed like an intelligent man for the job. He came to the base, and he was going to go down to Hanford, some type of a ceremony down there. They were doing something, opening a new building or whatever. But he flew into Moses Lake, Larson Air Force Base, and fortunately, I was part of the crew that was preparing for his visit and managed to get us all in the front row. And when he got off Air Force One, he was supposed to get on his helicopter and fly to Hanford. And he said, no, I want to go over here and meet these people. And he came over and shook hands with us.
Myra Hodek, the wife of a Larson Air Force pilot, was in the crowd that day.
I had both kids with me, went to the airport building, and there was a big crowd out there. But, I mean, I must have been from here to the end of the porch railing doing some people that I have seen that are famous like that. And this happened with me, is looking at the glow, almost a kind of a halo that was around him when he came to visit.
Less than 2 months after he landed at Larson Air Force Base, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. As with many people who were alive back then, those who lived in Moses Lake would remember where they were when they heard the news of President Kennedy's death. Ted Thomas was a combat crewman assigned to the underground control center of a Titan I missile site.
I was coming off alert and gassing up my car at the base, and on the car radio was the information that Kennedy was killed, and we all had to go back on alert.
Cliff Friday was a civilian technician who helped maintain the Titan I missile sites around Moses Lake.
Now, I'll tell you, when I was working out there, and I'd been there several months, is when Kennedy got shot. I was down in the hole when I heard that news.
You were down in missile silo?
Yeah, and I was working on the DC power.
Diana Holovets was a small child living on Larson Air Force Base.
My first memory was of Kennedy's funeral on TV.
On November 24th, 1963, Moses Lake held a memorial to join Kennedy's family and the world in honoring the fallen president. For Moses Lake residents who had recently met him, the joyful memory of his visit was now tempered by sorrow at his passing. But they would always remember the day he flew into Larson Air Force Base and made time to return their greeting.
There were a lot of things about that I remember vividly. They loved him.
I came on this trip to see the United States, and I can assure you that there is nothing more encouraging for any of us who work in Washington than to have a chance to fly across this United States and drive through it and see what a great country it is. The primary reason for my trip was conservation, and I include in conservation first our human resources and then our natural resources. There isn't very much that you can do today that will materially alter your life in the next 3 or 4 years in the field of conservation, but you can build for the future. You can build for the 70s, as those who went ahead of us built for us. Our task, the task of propelling a third wave of conservation in the United States, following that of Theodore Roosevelt and of Franklin Roosevelt, is to make science the servant of conservation and to devise new programs of land stewardship that will enable us to preserve this green environment, which means so much to all of us.